Hi and welcome. I'm Iris Benrubi, your host, and today I'm really excited to have Anita Nowak, and it's actually pronounced Novak, right?
That's right.
And Anita is a faculty lecturer. She is a multiple-time TEDx speaker, and your specialty is empathy. So I'm thrilled to have you on. And I think my first question to you is let's talk about empathy first. Let's define it. What is empathy?
Sure. So I think that's a great place to start because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what empathy means. A lot of people have different impressions. The words sympathy and pity and compassion are all used. So I've prepared a set of slides to actually walk your viewers through. So let me try to screen share and then we can take it from there. So let me know if you can see my slides.
We can see all of them. There we go.
Great. Okay. So in some instances, you could ask yourself, is this empathy? Is a handout? Is philanthropy empathy? Are a bunch of gentlemen wearing fake bellies when their wives are pregnant? Is that empathy? Or maybe this looks a little bit more familiar, helping somebody in distress. Typically, when I ask people, how do you define empathy? The response falls into a couple of camps of like stepping into someone else's shoes or seeing through someone else's eyes, right? So the way I define empathy is that it is the innate trait that unites us in our shared humanity. But very importantly, as a caveat, it doesn't discount lived experience because everybody has different experiences as a human, but we share a common humanity. And that's important. So empathy, actually, there's two aspects to empathy. There's cognitive empathy on one hand, which is our capacity to make. So this is something that we actively do or don't do. So we have the choice whether we engage in cognitive empathy or not. So when we're listening to somebody tell a story and we're reflecting on how that might feel for them or how that experience might be for them, we're engaging in cognitive empathy, and some of our best literature really, flexes our cognitive empathy muscle. On the other hand, there's affective empathy, which is spontaneous, and it's a natural phenomenon that happens in response to stimuli. So, for example, if I show you this image of this absolutely gorgeous girl, look what happened. You started to smile, and anybody who's watching, it's impossible not to feel this kind of contagious joy. But if you turn to this picture, your smile fades away. And just to bring this to light and a fine point on possible trigger warning, here again, here's this beautiful child running through water with glee, and whatever joy you're feeling just falls off a cliff when you look at an image like this. And this happens in your brain automatically, and that's affective empathy in play. So that's the first part of empathy that I think is important. There's actually four parts that I'll talk about today. The second part is that I place it on a continuum, fancy words, altruistic emotion continuum, but here are these words, pity, sympathy, compassion, and empathy, that are treated almost like synonyms, but they don't mean the same thing. Mm-hmm. So on the left side, when you pity someone, there's an inherent power differential embedded in the relationship. Oh, you poor person. And a lot of foreign aid or philanthropy is predicated on a really paternalistic pity paradigm. But as you make your way across the continuum and you get to empathy, you recognize that we share a common humanity. So even though we may have different lived experiences, we're born to different parents, different circumstances, different places on the planet, as a human being, we know we are all born, we know we'll all die, but we share this common humanity. And by virtue of being human, when you empathize with someone, you recognize that the person is as valuable with inherent rights and deserving of dignity and respect. So when you empathize, there's like the relationship is much more equal as opposed to asymmetric. The third thing I'd want to say about empathy is that we're born with the natural capacity to empathize, and there are a couple of exceptions. Anybody who has is a sociopath would be separate from that norm. And there is some research that shows that people who are on the autism spectrum have a different way of displaying or experiencing empathy. But if we talk about the general public, we're all born with the capacity to empathize, and we develop that capacity over time throughout our life. And that's thanks to not only our neural connections and brain plasticity, which I'll talk to in a second, but are also, again, our lived experiences. And there are certain developmental phases to empathy. I remember when I had my own daughter, I was delighted by something that happened when I was walking with my daughter in the park at 3 months. She was 3 months old. And there's something that happens at about the age of 3 when children start to develop emotional contagion, like when they're around kids that are laughing, crying, they'll cry. And just on cue, we were in the park and we walked by another mother and child couple, and that child was having a full-blown meltdown. And as soon as my daughter saw the kid crying, she spontaneously burst into tears, and I was thrilled because it was just like exactly right on time. The fourth and last thing I'll say about empathy, to answer your question, what is empathy, is that we can become more empathic with practice. So just like you go to the gym and you curl these weights for, to bulk up your biceps, thanks to brain plasticity, we can actually become more empathic with practice. And that's through thinking empathic thoughts and behaving in empathic ways. And, I'm simplifying this quite a bit. I think anybody who studies neuroscience would say maybe too simplistic, but the analogy I use is, if you imagine a football field in February in Canada, and a kid is trying to cross the field to get to school in the morning, and they're the first kid, and there's like 2 feet of snow, they have to do the hard trudging. But any typical kid that follows, or all the kids that follow, will walk in the same set of footprints to cross the field, and then a pathway will get established. That's more or less how our brain synaptic connections get formed over time. So the more you experience something, the easier you have a capacity to access. Children who are raised in empathic homes where members of the family are behaving empathically, the child will develop a proclivity towards empathy, and likewise the corollary as well. But what that means is, as humans, because we have cognitive empathy, we can train our brains to become more empathic. So we can think more empathic thoughts, we can experiment with becoming more empathic by behaving that way, and then it becomes more automatic. So that's what I wanted to share to answer your question. What is empathy for me?
All right. So, I mean, that brings up a great question for me. And did you want to keep doing the slide share, or there we go? For a lot of people that I work with, they didn't grow up in a home that was very empathetic. They either had a very critical parent or an emotionally unavailable parent, sometimes both. So what are the next steps if they've grown in that kind of family? What's the impact on them, and what's the future?
Yeah, it's not an easy answer, but there certainly are pathways to heal and become more empathic despite circumstances. So, there's this idea that in the 0 to 3 age, a baby's brain is going to see the most development than in the rest of their life. So those 0 to 3 years are really important and critical. And our brains naturally prune away synaptic connections that aren't used. So if a child is growing up in a hostile environment and there's lots of yelling or, God forbid, violence, then some of their empathic brain synaptic connections will prune away. That doesn't mean they can't revive them. And certainly, even if the 0 to 3 is not the issue, and a child grows up, with circumstances, stress in the home through their teens, and maybe that'll stunt some kind of empathy, they can still overcome that. And so there's a certain degree of healing for sure on a psychological level, but it's the notion that you can read more literature. There's actually research that shows reading fiction can enhance your capacity to empathize. And then there's just the action of empathizing on a regular basis until it becomes more automatic. So even when I was doing my doctoral research and I learned of this, I tried to experiment a bit. And so what I share is that once I decided, okay, I wanted to test out, altruism. Okay, so I was reading about people who were willing to give away organs to strangers, which is like an ultimate act of altruism, right? Because there's great health risks. I wasn't willing to go that far, but I was willing to pay it forward at Tim Hortons. So as a grad student, my limit was $5, but I'd go through the drive-through and I'd ask what the order behind was, and if it was under $5, I'd pay it. And then initially in the first couple of weeks of doing this experiment, I'd go through a drive-through maybe twice. I would look in the rear view mirror and I would catch the person, in the rear view and see them, and they'd, wave a hi or, toast me with their little double. And I realized I was getting a payoff. And so I'd kind of botched my own experiment. So I had to let go of that and just drive away without the feedback loop of sort of feeling appreciated. And over time, I paid it forward and drove away, just hoping that had sort of like an impact on their day. And I found that experience gave me opportunities all day long throughout my week to do random acts of kindness. I would seek them out, and then it became more sort of like more part of my nature. This is over several years. Another story I share is that, I was once at a FedEx during the holiday season in December. And this is before mobile phones where we had easy distraction. So I was in a lineup for like 20 minutes. And by the time I got to the counter, the woman was just really not nice, like, worst words to describe her. And you can, as a client, one up that and say, okay, customer service, what's wrong with you? But I actually took a second just to put a pause on that and asked her, like, is everything okay? Very genuinely. And she paused for a second and realized I wasn't being antagonistic. And she burst into tears and talked to me about how she was working double shifts. Her kid at home was sick. And so, we just had this moment of exchange as humans, and that opened some things up. And so, we can practice being more empathic, throughout our days. So that would be my long answer to your question.
Yeah, I got tears when you said that. And catch myself in that. And, when I'm dealing with customer service that are really being gnarly, for lack of a better word, I'll often say, it sounds like you're having a bad day, and you can just see them relax, right? And I've had the same thing with Tim Hortons, where it was really hard to drive away and not look back and get that feedback. That was so important. I wanted to know that they realized I was being a good person.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, what opened up for you from that first exercise where you learned to walk away without getting the feedback and still doing the acts of empathy? What did that open up for you?
A lot, because I realized fundamentally that when we are in service to others, and that's something I call empathic action, don't expect anything in return. That's when we get something that returns to us in this karmic kind of feedback loop that the universe provides for us. It changes as soon as you actually, hope for something to get paid off. If you anticipate this feedback, then it doesn't work. But if you have faith that I'm going to be kind, be generous, offer acts of kindness, engage in empathic action without any return, somewhere along the lines, your life just gets enriched in ways that I don't think we have proof or evidence for, but that I know to be true. So for me, it changed my life. I have a memory from a long time ago being at Heathrow Airport. I was what's the word when you're sent back? It's a formal word when you get sent back at the border.
Yeah, I don't remember it either.
Oh, it's not expelled or expunged, but it's something. It'll come to me in a second. So imagine I'd been in a relationship for 8 years, and there was the tail end of it was long distance, and I thought I was coming home to an engagement. I thought everything had, like, we'd crossed the threshold and passed through the test of long distance. And I came home to a breakup 4 days later, which I did not see coming, and it was devastating. And a few months later, I decided to just go abroad and tend to my wounds backpack. And I landed in the UK, and as a Canadian passport holder who's traveled a lot, I didn't, give the border crossing a second thought. But the woman asked me, where I'm staying tonight. And I was staying at a friend's place who was living in London. And she said, okay, can I have her address? And I said, I don't actually know her address because she's here at the gates waiting for me. She says, well, what if something's come up while you're flying? Then you must have some contact information. So I pulled out an old fashioned hand, like a paper agenda, and I flipped through it and I found a phone number. And I thought, okay, that's it. Here's the phone number. I have some contact information. She said, may I see your agenda? And so while she was flipping through my agenda and I had nothing to hide, she discovered that I'd circled last day at, like my employer. I'd left my employer. And she said, so are you working right now? And I said, no. And long story short, she proceeded to go through an entire investigation and, ripping open nooks and crannies in my luggage, and ultimately concluded that I was arriving as a tourist, but in fact, I was here to work. So the word that I was looking for earlier was deported back to Canada on the next flight home. And before the decision had been made, I was actually in a room with a lot of other people who were in similar circumstances. And I remember this experience of these two British authorities coming to see a woman who was seated. She was wearing a hijab. This was in 2004 during the Iraq War. And she had a child by her side. And these two authorities who were, decked in real, in uniforms and packing arms, they told her to get up. They wanted to take a picture of her and they wanted her to take off her hijab. And I remember thinking, I had the sinking feeling in my stomach, there's Heathrow who sees an airport that sees everybody from every part of the planet, a place where she could do this in privacy. But I didn't say anything. And they yelled at her because she didn't understand English, and they thought maybe speaking loudly, somehow the English would come. So finally they motioned to her to get up. So she got up, and the kid was crying and trembling. And I couldn't tell you how distraught I was, how terrible it felt to just be a bystander to this. But because the decision hadn't been made, to this very day, I regret that I didn't say anything and step in on her behalf. So it was like an empathic action failure on my part. And they actually took a picture of her and mocked her right in front of her, oh, is the child a boy or a girl? Maybe the child's a hermaphrodite, ha, 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 ha. And I said nothing. Mm-hmm. And so I think, the work and the research that I've done about empathy has changed some of my ways of being in the world. And I'm infinitely, over a decade, a happier person as a result of the work I've done.
Yeah, empathy is about connection. It's not that patriarchal one up, one down. It's about we are together, we are one. Yeah, I can feel the tears again.
Well, we're in a moment now where we could all flex our empathy muscles in a new way. And it's unfortunate, but in some places we're seeing that happen. And then in other places, fear holds us in a grip, right? And it's really hard to empathize when you're just scared. Mm-hmm. And so right now with COVID, I'm seeing not only strange behavior, but all this judgment, everybody's judging each other without really having an understanding of where that person and family is coming from. So, whether it's judging somebody who's out for a run and not wearing a face mask, well, maybe they have asthma and they can't, and maybe they need to go for a run for their mental health. We need to extend a little bit more empathy to one another, especially in these circumstances.
Yeah, so let's talk about what is the opportunity right now at a time where people are isolated. They may be feeling anxiety, stress, concern, worry, loneliness. How does empathy fit into all of this? How does it play out?
Well, there's lots of research that shows that, we as a species developed a capacity to empathize over millennia. And that was for survival, right? So if we were in clans and one person decided to be selfish, then that would come at a cost to the group. So this idea of cooperation and collaboration was essential. And if somebody acted in ways that were self-serving, they would be ostracized. And then, without the support of the clan, were left to their own devices and would ultimately mean death. So over time, we have developed capacity to be cooperative and collaborative. And you see that, primatologists have studied chimpanzees and more recently studied bonobos, and people who are interested in this research might want to pick up a book or a couple of books by Frans de Waal. He's a Dutch primatologist, and he basically says, we spent 50 years studying chimps, and we came to the conclusion that human nature is hierarchical and power hungry, and we're violent by nature. But he's like, if we'd studied bonobos for the last 50 years, we'd come to the conclusion that we're collaborative and cooperative by nature, and they literally solve their feuds through group lovemaking sessions, right? Make love, not war. So what was your question? Yeah, the question is, how can we behave differently? I feel like in our society there's a narrative that we are by nature competitive, but in fact there are many examples over history, and we all know it to be true from our own personal lives, where people are more than happy to sacrifice and cooperate together and give willingly to help other people. And what's happening now, I think, is that there's so much fear through social media and just the traditional media, all these headlines that we're being bombarded all the time, that we have to protect ourselves at all costs, that we don't get to live up to our empathic potential. And so that's playing out in micro ways, where in the beginning we were hoarding toilet paper. I mean, like, that was like a crazy phenomenon that played out, right? But there's reasons for it. And now we are afraid to I mean, of course I understand the whole idea of social distancing, but at some point I'm sensing that we have to think about the health of society writ large. So of course the pandemic, when it initially hit, we needed to flatten the curve, and we needed to go through this exercise of social isolation. But now that it's been 2 months, and now that we know that it disproportionately affects older seniors, we need to have a strategy for them. And it disproportionately affects people who are living in high density circumstances. So we need policies that support those neighborhoods. We also have to take into consideration the general health and well-being of society. We know after 2 months that the incidence of domestic violence has spiked, and that has health costs for women, but children, if you're talking about, their brain synaptic connections in terms of what they're being exposed to in the home, that's not healthy. And I've read somewhere recently that the attempted suicide rate has tripled in North America as a result of social isolation, because we're social beings by nature. So I think we need to, reflect carefully without giving into fear, because our brains can't be in a state of fear and gratitude and extension and empathy at the same time. So if we want to be more empathic, we have to find ways to mitigate the fear. So, mindfulness exercises, all that stuff comes into play.
Yes, what comes up for me is I've been blessed to be hired up into Northern Ontario, where I'm working with an Indigenous nation and flying in every month. And what I really saw is how important the community is for them. And that's something that's so different than down here, at least where I am in Toronto, probably in most big cities, where it's so individualistic. And I love to hear how their concern up north is all about, how will this impact the community? How can we do something to create, betterment for the community? And I'm imagining that that's what you're inviting us to get back to, is creating those kinds of bonds with people, even when we don't know who they are.
Precisely. And that's why I think there's every day an opportunity when you go to the store and you buy some groceries to spend a few extra intentional minutes having a conversation to thank that person who's, taking extra risks, and it's not just the cashiers, it's the bus drivers, the delivery people, the postmen and women. There's so many people who are working in essential services, and typically they're not the best paid in our society. So, I love the stories of people who continue to send money to their, domestic help, if they have help in the home to clean their homes, like to continue to support them. And when the restaurants reopen, to be extra generous with the service staff, go for the 20% tip and above,
Yeah, so I want to bring this into, single women, single men, but single women specifically who are really struggling with isolation right now, can't touch, they can't be hugged, they're missing a lot of the face-to-face depending on where they're living. What is the connection? And I imagine there is a connection between practicing empathy and that sense of isolation.
Yeah. So we are social beings by nature, and the fact that we're not going to offices anymore, forget about the intimacy, just, the socializing. Thankfully, that's beginning to lift. So there's light at the end of the tunnel. But, and also Canadian winter's coming to an end, right? So it went from winter to summer almost overnight. It's 35 degrees in Montreal right now. The idea of just going out for walks and, keeping a social distance, I think, for us, it's really important, not only like the physical walk, but just reconnecting. There's research that's showing that we're having Zoom fatigue, and because it's foreign to us to actually have something that mediates the conversation. Like you and I may be completely attuned to one another, and people who are watching may be listening carefully, but that requires a lot of extra attention to do. Whereas, when we're in each other's company, there's things that we're picking up in terms of our interpersonal communication that is not in the words, even in the tone of voice. It's just something that, that we're in resonance with each other that gets missed through the technology, which is interesting why a lot of people are trying to, consider how VR and avatars could potentially help in that matter. I've done some research about, how robots are being used in homes in Japan to help keep older people who are suffering from dementia and Alzheimer's, at least keep them company, right? Mm-hmm. But to get back to your question about like single women, there's no question that human touch is essential to our well-being. I think I've read research that for optimal health, we need about 5 hugs a day. And if we're not getting 5 hugs a day, that means it's chipping away at our immunity, our respiratory system, our circulatory system. So like there's physiological benefits to actually feeling touch. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can indulge our senses, even while we're feel more holistic. So baths are important with scents, keeping candles burning, brushing our hair, running our hands through our hair, tactile things that we can do. Mm-hmm. But certainly it's going to be very, very important that when we are able to be in closer proximity, that we do give a lot of space for hand holding and just sitting near each other and just sort of sensing each other's presence. I think we're going to need to rebound as a human body.
Yeah. And so what I'm hearing is acknowledge what it is that you're feeling. It's real. You're missing that touch, that connection, that resonance with another. Give yourself that space that when we start to come back, that you may need a lot of it to recalibrate.
Yeah.
I would also imagine that any opportunity for someone who's feeling isolated to do an act of empathy, even if you're still driving through the coffee drive-through, that it's an opportunity to grow your connection to another, even someone that you don't know.
Absolutely. And, there are crisis lines, obviously, to call if you're really suffering. But I think there are opportunities, even through, people that you haven't spoken to in a long time, but are Facebook friends, just to send them a quick message to say, interested in having a phone call or a Zoom call for 10, 15 minutes and reconnect. And I certainly would encourage the conversation. I mean, it'll always, under these circumstances, start with, so like, how's it going during COVID? But to depart from that as quickly as possible and to find other ways to savor. There's, in positive psychology, the idea is, the vacation is really helpful but it's dreaming about the vacation and then savoring the memories of the vacation. So any way that you can have, an opportunity to reconnect with a friend or an acquaintance over something that you enjoyed and savoring that experience and having a good laugh or bringing some levity into your life is a good way to connect.
All right, Anita, for people who want to connect with you, where's a good place for them to find you or find out about you?
Great. So I have an Empathic Action community on Facebook. So you just Google Empathic Action. I post daily posts. I have a YouTube channel by the same name. And obviously they can find me by just, Googling my name. I have a website, and my Gmail is empathicaction@gmail.com.
Beautiful. And so if there was one thing you would hope our viewers take away from today's call, what would you say that would be?
That having the capacity to empathize with others also requires self-compassion. Mm-hmm. And it's very much that metaphor of we need to take care of ourselves first so that we can extend empathy outward. The win is there. The win-win is there. The better care we take of ourselves, the better we are able to take care of others, and that it comes back to us.
That's beautiful. And with that, I want to say thank you for the time that you've given us, the strategies that you've shared, and the difference you make in the world.
Thanks so much. It was a great pleasure, Iris, and thanks to everybody who's watching or listening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.